Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the journey back to work. We're delighted to be joined here today by our members Adair HRM, who will facilitate today's panel discussion. And joining us today, we have the Head of Consulting, Catherine Smith McKiernan. We have Tony MacDonald, who's Head and Safety Consultant. We have Sarah Fagan, Senior HR and Employment Law Consultant, and we have Gary Monks, who's the Business Development Manager. It's been a very busy week for most of us as we start to see the reopening of our city and county, but there are still questions to be answered and a lot of uncertainty as we move forward. And hopefully today will bring more clarity. So please feel free to use the chat box to ask questions, and Linda is joining us here as well, and she'll bring them to the panel's attention towards the end of the session. So in the meantime, can I wish you all the very best in reopening. We continue to work remotely ourselves, but are on hand at any time should any of you need us. So for now, I'll hand you over to Catherine to begin today's session. So thank you very much for attending.
Thanks, Gerald. It's nice to be here, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen as we're all getting used to these Zoom meetings now. So if there's any problems, you can let me know. Share. So I'm sharing my screen now. And as Gerald said, this is a returning to work panel discussion and presentation that we'll be leading. And it's all about the return to work protocols that the government published now a couple of weeks ago, but then accelerated in terms of progress last Friday. So what we would like to do this morning is talk to you a little bit about those return to work protocols, and particularly reference our own Adare Human Resource Management return to work journey. So before I do that, what I'll do is I'll give you a little bit of background about Adare Human Resource Management. We are an employment law, industrial relations and best practice human resource management advisory firm. And what we do is provide solutions to help your organization in terms of addressing any human resource challenges that you may have. We provide a number of different services across the HR and employment law support spectrum, including consultancy services, conflict and dispute resolution, organisation development and change, employment law, industrial relations, as I said, and we can provide support on-site and off-site, and we develop a number of different communications to keep you in touch and in the know in terms of what's happening in the employment law landscape. We have recently relaunched our online resource, Linea, which is the most comprehensive, up-to-date online resource available for HR practitioners. And what that resource does is through a licensed access, it provides you with information around case law. It has checklists and templates, frequently asked questions in the HR space. It has research that we've conducted in our HR barometer that we do annually. And it has various sector related insights, as well as some toolkit templates on there for you to use as you navigate your various HR challenges and support your organization in its development. Today presenting is me, Catherine. My background is I'm a career business consultant. I've worked in a number of different organisations, working most recently with Adare Human Resource Management, heading up consulting, and mainly in the area of change, transformation and organisation development. We will also hear today from Tony MacDonald, who is, as Jared said, our health and safety consultant. He is a former firefighter, paramedic, and he is our lead safety consultant in Adare Human Resource Management. So he'll be talking you through the health and safety aspects of the return to work protocol. With Tony today, we have Sarah Fagan, who's our senior HR employment law consultant. Sarah advises a wide variety of organisations across a number of sectors and has practical experience in industrial relations, employee relations, and particularly in employment law. She advises clients on compliance, restructuring and redundancies. So you'll be hearing from both Tony MacDonald and Sarah Fagan this morning, and we will field questions as they come in, as Gerald said, using the chat box. Okay, so in terms of context, COVID-19, as we all know, and we've been experiencing for the past 3 months, has disrupted the world. It's dramatically altered how we live every day, how we interact with one another from a social distancing perspective and a hygiene, and the way we meet and greet, and in particular now in terms of how we do business. Many of us are working remotely much of the time at the moment, and now it's about how we get back to that new norm. So in the past 3 months, we've really been managing through a crisis situation, and the goalpost shifted from where we were in terms of very upward trajectory from an economic growth perspective into a crisis management situation for lots of organizations. Businesses responded quickly and put in place the necessary measures to respond to the crisis they were faced with. Your individual teams have responded, and at the time of the crisis, that change was particularly difficult and hard. And unfortunately, we now have to change again as we return to workplaces and get the economy back up and running. So to put everything in context, returning to work needs planning and careful management. And in line with the planning and management that the government protocol has put in, we have developed a return to work journey called the Journey Back to Work, which focuses on a number of key aspects of the returning to work protocol that the government issued a number of weeks ago. And it cuts across employee engagement and communications, health and safety, well-being, communications, HR policies and procedures, workforce planning, and in particular workforce practices that you may need to address in your organizations. One of the key elements that we've introduced to this journey back to work are some unintended consequences, and towards the end of this presentation, we'll take a look at those unintended consequences that implementing some of the measures within the return to work protocol may bring about. So I'll hand over to Sarah now to talk about the first couple of steps in terms of thinking about the return to work protocol, employee engagement and communication. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Catherine. Hello, everybody. You're all very welcome today. So when we're looking at employee engagement and communication, I think the first thing to note is that, as Catherine said, a lot of businesses reacted quite quickly, in terms of the lockdown of the country, in implementing practices that their workforce could work from home and so forth. But now we're in the situation where everybody is talking about the return to work, and that's probably initiated initially from the publication of the return to work safety protocols, but also with the lifting of restrictions and the announcements that were made last Friday. And when it comes to employee engagement, it's very difficult, or you can be in a very difficult position as an employer to actually understand, how do I get buy-in from my employees? How do I keep them engaged throughout this transitionary process as we move returning to the workplace? And what we have been advising clients, and what we've seen that would work quite well, is in fact a pulse survey to understand really where your employees are in terms of their workload, in terms of the work practices, in terms of their wants and needs. As we know, a lot of employees are obviously feeling quite anxious in terms of returning to the workplace. And communication is integral to sort of transition them to that place. So ultimately, when you're looking at a pulse survey, you're really about trying to gain information from employees in terms of, the requirements for remote working to continue on. Do they have any underlying health conditions that should be addressed? Is there any issues pertaining to childcare arrangements? And that will help inform your decisions that you make in terms of returning them to the workplace. And it's really important that the employees are able to give their feedback, because it has to be a two-way street when it comes to communication. What we have found is that it is essential that all employers are looking at the short, medium and long term. And while we might have done that initially when employees moved to remote working, when the lockdown commenced, we now need to look at it from here on out, and the return to work safely protocols in the short, medium and long term. What do you need to do to keep your employees engaged? Your pulse survey will advise you on that and certain actions that will be taken. But what kind of communications do you need to prepare? We would always suggest having a communications plan that would align to the return to work plan, highlighting the key milestones that are going to be in place or put in place, the actions or the initiatives that will be taken by management, so that all employees are aware of what has been done. That's the only way to actually make them feel comfortable in returning, in transitioning, and engaging in terms of the work. And the importance of transparent communication can't be underestimated. So when you are looking at communications, you need to consider, and Tony's going to get into it in 1 second, but you need to consider, what are we doing in the return to work safely protocols? How do we communicate that? What happens after that? What happens in relation to work practices, policies and procedures, health and well-being? How do we look at those areas and how do we communicate them effectively? And the main thing is just to be transparent with them. Obviously, I'll be hitting on some of those areas that I've just mentioned further on in the presentation, but in terms of employee engagement and communication, just be as transparent as possible. If you do that, you will be in better stead with your employees as they return to the workforce.
Thanks, Sarah. Just a quick question while we're here.
Yep.
Should it be one single voice communicating to employees, or should the engagement come from the line manager?
Well, it really is essential, first of all, that the management team are all on the same page when it comes to communications. But you need to ensure that your line managers are really in touch with employees, so that they're able to communicate, what the changes are that are going to come about, what actions are being taken, and really to have that high level sort of communication plan between line managers and employees that can feed back up into senior management, who will then communicate the same information in the same manner. But it's just important that line managers do play a role to ensure that employees feel that they can actually express any concerns, air any grievances, or discuss any alternatives to work that might assist management in making those plans as they return to the workforce.
That's great. Thank you very much. We'll hand over to Tony now. Tony, you're just on mute there, so you might want to mute yourself while I change the slide over.
Good afternoon, everybody. So the return to work safety protocol, the COVID-19 response plan is one of the features that falls out of the protocol. And as the Minister said when she was launching the plan 3 weeks ago, it's mandatory. So the response plan that falls out of the protocol is equally mandatory. The response plan itself is going to, it's like a mini safety statement. It will cover COVID from A to Z in every detail as to how an employer is going to respond. But it's not just one-way traffic. As Sarah said, it's all about buy-in. So even if COVID never existed, under health and safety legislation, particularly Section 26, there was always that requirement to consult and liaise with staff, because the first thing the Health and Safety Authority have asked me on many an occasion when assembling risk assessment was, well, did you engage with the staff who are ultimately going to be using the risk assessment? So that's just a continuum of health and safety brought into the COVID-19. So your response plan, as I say, will have everything in it relevant to your place of employment, how you will engage with the staff that Sarah alluded to, what the plans are going to be, and particularly the suspected case, the isolation area, and sometimes the isolation areas, because depending on the risk assessment and the potential for having more than one suspected outbreak, you may have to have other isolation areas. With regards to the safety statement, again, that's nothing new about updating that. There was always a requirement under Section 19 of the Health and Safety Act of 2005 that safety statements had to be reviewed at least annually. And the wording is at least is you could have a brand new safety statement in January, but because things change for whatever reason in February, you have to review it even though you only have it a month. So that it's in keeping with that legislation that's always been there. But now we're talking today about COVID. So therefore COVID has to be in there. What you have in place with regards to your response plan, your suspected case will be all cross-referenced in your safety statement. But most importantly, down at the rear of the safety statement, where risk assessments of every type and description are kept, you're going to have a bespoke risk assessment relevant to COVID-19. How you see COVID coming into the premises, should it come in, contact points, visitors, contractors, etc. And then also how you address that in the safety statement, what you're going to do about those risky areas of contractors or visitors or whatever you discover. So you have to set out in quite detail the risk assessment. And the Health and Safety Authority are the ones who have been given the powers, as they always have for health and safety, but they've been given the powers to follow up on complaints or ad hoc inspections or whatever they feel. And one of the first things they'll be looking for is the paperwork. But then the paperwork are really the first 2 points, but then you need to have lead worker representatives. And again, that's mandatory. That person or persons, because you have to have the appropriate number within the premises or the employment. And that lead worker is a liaison between the staff generally and the management that's going to be set aside to deal with COVID. You should have nominated people so that it's us, everybody is working together, there's no them and us. So the lead worker is the conduit between all the different parties. But apart from that, after they get sufficient training, which is usually in about a little over 2 hours, 2.5 hours training, that lead worker is also inbuilt the compliance officer. So they're ensuring that cough etiquette is out there, gels are there, wash hand facilities, paper towels are all being replenished. The appropriate signage is out there. But most importantly, they're a representative and they're answering queries. And if they don't have queries, they get onto the likes of Adair and get the answers there. Another feature that's mandatory is the COVID-19 induction training. And that is given out to all employees within the place of employment. To digress for a second, as the employer, you've got to look for the weak spots for where COVID could possibly come in. So on that point, you've got to look at contractors coming in, visitors, and ask them, have they been had induction training? So for example, and it's only an example, you have an electrician coming in to do 2 or 3 days work. Well, you want to be assured that they have done their COVID-19 induction training so that they know the do's and the don'ts, etc. Like all training, and jumping back again to the health and safety legislation, all training and all information, the response plan up at the top there is a requirement that foreign nationals, if English is not their first language and they don't have a good grasp of that, it's incumbent on the employer to ensure, as per the 2005 Act, that all employees understand what's being given to them in a language that's understood. So that's a requirement that you need to know, and that also rolls out to the likes of signage, etc. And then probably one of the most important plans is your suspected case response plan. Because you want to ensure that from business continuity, you don't want to be closing down again. Plus, you've also got the welfare of your employees to the fore. So within that response plan, you're going to have in there who's going to respond, where the suspected case is going to be brought to, an isolation area that I referred to earlier, and the PPE equipment that's going to be available, etc. We would recommend that where they're available, they should be first aid responders, because that's their training before COVID. The person is a patient and nothing has changed, being a COVID suspected case. So they're treated with all the dignity and all the correctness of a first aid response. So those people will need appropriate PPE, such as face shields, because they'll be closer in some cases to the 2 meter rule. But leaving first aiders aside, on that last point, suspected case, you need to have your isolation area. You need to have people maintaining the 2-meter distance. And when the incident is over and you've sorted it out, you review, see what went right, what went wrong. And then really, really importantly, part of that response plan is deep cleaning of the area that the employee came from, deep cleaning of the first aid stroke isolation room. So if there's any questions.
That's great. Thanks, Tony. There's a couple of questions here. So the first one is, what do you think the biggest challenge under the health and safety protocols will be?
The biggest challenge, as I see it, is getting the last point there, your suspected case. Because if you don't get that right, as I said a moment ago, from the welfare of the employees and your business continuity, that's where things can fall down. So it's really, really, that's your challenge, getting those ducks in a row, so to speak.
Okay, and just two more before we move on to the next part. Are there any recommended or minimum ventilation standards for office space in light of the new protocols?
There is, but they don't go into too much detail, and I'll tell you why. You'll find the answer in the 2007 the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work regulations of 2007. You'll find a particular small chapter in there on ventilation. But we've got to remember, buildings are designed by architects, by engineers, so ventilation is there, whether it's natural ventilation, as in X amount of windows, will be a key feature designed into the building, or if that's not the case, where you've windows that are sealed and not opened, you then have HVAC, the heating and ventilation, air conditioning systems, etc. So you'll either have A or B. They're designed by professionals to meet the regulations. So I've never come across a place that doesn't meet the regulations unless somebody has changed something. But yeah, as I say, it'll be A or B.
And final one for now, is there any advantage of using plastic chairs over any other kind of chair in the workplace given COVID-19 response plan?
Well, the advantage would be that they're easily wiped down with the damp cloths, with the disinfectant, etc. But if we think of timber chairs, etc., they're equally easily wiped down. Leather stroke PVC chairs in an office setting are easily done. So it really depends on the type and the risk assessment that's put in. But by and large, there's no problem with chairs for cleanliness and hygiene. Okay,
great. Thanks, Tony. We'll move on to the next one, which Sarah will be taking us through, which is health and wellbeing and HR policies and procedures. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Catherine. Everyone is aware that adopting the protocols and communicating the measures really is essential when it comes to the maintenance of an employee's health and safety. And because a lot of employees are going to be returning from periods of isolation, it's really important that you are actually trying to support that and address it by communicating effectively what measures are in place to ensure that employees are aware, from the health and safety aspect, and as Tony just discussed, what actions have been taken in terms of the COVID-19 response plan, the suspected case response plan, because people will be anxious about contracting the disease, and to put their minds at rest and to ensure that you're compliant as well with the protocols, because obviously the health and safety inspectorate can visit your premises to ensure that compliance. Communicate those measures out. Other areas to consider when you're thinking of the mental well-being of all your employees is ensuring that there are publicly available sources of information in relation to the management of COVID-19. So we've seen, a great level of detail that's available obviously on the HSE website. But there are other sources as well, gov.ie provide a lot of information, and you need to ensure that even though, most people would take it as a given that that those sites have that type of information, but as an employer, it is your duty and your obligation to ensure that that is communicated out, that employees are aware of where they can find that information, and that they can approach, for example, the lead worker representative or a nominated person of management to get that type of information. Other considerations around well-being are obviously to ensure that you have, if possible, an employee assistance program, and obviously a referral system to an occupational health service provider in the event that anyone has a concern in relation to their health and well-being, or if an employer has a concern in relation to an employee's health and well-being. In terms of continued support when they are back in the workplace, you need to ensure that, you know, through the adoption of the measures under the protocols, that you are following the return to work safely protocols, that you are limiting, for example, office environments, face-to-face meetings, you're limiting business trips in terms of customer-facing roles, that you actually have the correct measures in place, and you have the monitoring system in place to ensure that that will, you know, be a continued source of assessment and detailing objectives, how to deal with issues that may arise. And it all falls into the health and safety space, but mental health and well-being is really important. And we've seen, you know, a lot of sort of articles and information pieces on mental health and well-being. So there is an employer obligation there. There is an obligation under the protocols itself, but as well as the health and safety legislation to maintain a safe place of work, to ensure that the welfare of all your employees are, you know, is paramount to your considerations. The other areas obviously that you would be looking at, and it ties in with mental well-being, is having the appropriate policies and procedures in place. Now, ultimately, you know, when you think of mental health well-being, you want to ensure that you have an absence management policy in place. This would also cover sick leave absences. And, you know, while people will be reviewing them, and they should, of course, review them at this point, you want to make sure that you're hitting on the key points, like referral to a company doctor or an occupational health service provider. You want to ensure that you're very clear and transparent in your policies in relation to payment for sick leave absences. You want to ensure that when it comes to sick leave management and absence management, that you are having a return to work meeting, even if it's virtually for a period of time, with all employees who are returning to work, again, to, you know, to ensure that their health and well-being is being managed upon their return to work from a period of absence. And that you're updating your policy if you don't have these items listed in it. Other policies that obviously have to be reviewed is, you know, a remote working policy. What are your plans for the future? If you're looking at the short, medium, and long term in returning to the workplace, are you going to have a hybrid or a blended type of return to work? Are you assessing the needs of the organization and then listening to the employees about their preferences and seeing if those two items match, to then develop a policy that will be implemented to cover off some form of blended form of remote working? You need to assess pay and remuneration policies. If, for example, you have those types of policies that would reference, for example, you know, bonus payments or commission payments, obviously you need to be reviewing them at this moment in time to see how is your business being impacted. You know, obviously with most organizations having moved to remote working, we're not forgetting the organizations that had to completely shut down. And in those situations, there wasn't any actual work taking place, or there could be, you know, changes to the level of investment in the business that would then be reflected in the pay and remuneration policies. I would as well recommend that all employers are reviewing their, I suppose, the family-friendly policies, if we could term it in that way, you know, trying to address situations where employees won't be able to attend work for childcare reasons. Are you going to introduce an unpaid leave policy? If remote working can't be accommodated in every instance, what about the promotion of your parental leave policy? Like, obviously there are statutory entitlements that, you know, are enshrined from legislation when it comes to various types of leaves of absence, but not every employee may be aware of them. And ultimately, you know, you need to be assessing those to ensure that they're fit for purpose, they're legislatively compliant, but that you're reintroducing them to the employees and communicating them. So, for example, the force majeure leave policies, parental leave, paternity leave, all these options are available to employees, and you need to really understand what way is your business going, how is it impacted by COVID-19, now and in the immediate future? And are there any other policies that you should be introducing? In terms of COVID-19, you want to be ensuring that you're covering, handshaking policies and physical distancing, respiratory etiquette and so forth. So there's a lot to consider in this area when you are sort of reviewing, what are the obligations of an employer. But it's really about knowing your business, knowing the needs currently and how those needs may change in the future to then develop, assess, review the current policies that you have.
Thanks, Sarah. One question just before we move on. Is there any specific policy that needs to be implemented for absence related to COVID-19 infection or someone who may have been in contact with a COVID-19 infection?
Well, obviously the first thing I suppose to state, and it seems self-explanatory, but it's really to follow the guidance of the Health and Safety Authority and the HSE in relation to any COVID-related absence. We know that the COVID-19 illness benefit payment is still in situ. More than likely it will remain for a period of time. And, with that comes a requirement to get medically certified period of self-isolation. So that's something that you might want to include in your absence management policies, or at least adapt the policies to accommodate it for that temporary period of time, even though I suppose we're all waiting for the vaccine and we're hoping that, it's coming in the near future. But it's really about assessing your current absence management policies to see, are you covering all of those types of instances in terms of people being required to self-isolate and remain home, and ensuring that you engage with employees as well. It's something that I forgot to mention, but it's really important that, in terms of the current policies that you have and your employee handbook, there's certain legislative changes that you will just communicate out. But if you're changing the work practices itself in any respect, you need to engage with employees. You need to consult with them to ensure that, they're in agreement with what you're proposing for any changes to policies.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. We'll move on.
No problem.
So working practices, there are some particular things that we all need to consider in terms of this new working practice point of view. So you might take us through some of that.
Yeah. So look, when it comes to working practices, and it has been highlighted in the return to work safety protocols, it is essential for all employers. And look, they're doing it already. Like we can see it, with everything that's open since Monday. They're trying to bring in working practices that are really aligned to the health and safety provisions that are outlined in the protocols itself. And part of that is an assessment of the needs of your organization, the needs of your employees. And then, of course, obviously, any, Tony, I think mentioned earlier, any contractors that come on site, or if you're in customer facing roles, your clientele, your customers, how are you managing those working practices to align them to the health and safety objectives of the protocols? So you're doing that in the first instance, obviously from a health and safety perspective, and as Tony discussed, you're looking at the requirements and the measures that are to be implemented in terms of physical distancing. That applies whether it's customer facing or otherwise, but it also means that you'll be looking at the type of work that your teams are doing, your individual employees are doing, and seeing where you can get, appointed small teams together to work collaboratively. You also need to ensure that, there is cross-training of those employees who are in those smaller teams in the event, and I suppose the unfortunate event that some employee does contract COVID-19, to make sure that there is a business continuity plan when it comes to specific roles, functions, duties, and that's where cross-training comes in. The other area, obviously, that would have to be highlighted is, remote working. I touched on it a few seconds ago. What are you planning to do in the immediate future and in the longer term? Will there be a continued blended approach? Will there be staggered return periods, staggered shifts, extended shift periods to cover, everything that is required in the business, but also to maintain the health and safety aspect of the protocols. So it really is about, assessing your needs as a company and as your business, and then adapting those needs to the health and safety requirements, and then managing those work practices that flow from it in terms of changes to shift practices or shared office space, and ensuring that, you know, there is, like the last point there, managing breaks. That applies in the office, you know, the fact that you might have a communal a kitchenette area or a canteen area. How are you going to manage the work practices when it comes to people taking their, you know, contractual right to a lunch break, or, you know, even a break in the morning or afternoon? You are going to have to stagger those times to ensure that physical distancing can continue and can be applied within the workplace, all in the maintenance of health and safety. But it really is, you know, unique to each organization, because, you know, some businesses are smaller businesses. So ultimately, how will they manage, you know, the shift patterns? How will they manage opening times? Everything should be, you know, communicated to employees, and there should be engagement with employees. Like, that's really integral when it comes to working practices, because you need their buy-in. It's not just about unilaterally imposing changes to work practices. It's about that conversation piece, that communication piece, you know, to ensure that you're getting the feedback of the employees. They might have some great ideas as well, you know, that could be used in terms of changes to work practices, but it also means bringing them along in the journey with you, that you're all doing it together as a community, rather than, you know, silo decisions being made in relation to changes to work practices.
So just before we move on to the next one, which is a really interesting one in terms of workforce planning, what would you do in this, suggest employers do in a situation where somebody refuses to engage in the changes to the working practices that are required to return to work effectively?
I suppose that if a client came to me and, you know, they posed that question to me, the first thing that I would say is, look, you know, all employees have contractual obligations. That goes without saying. If they don't have contractual obligations, you're not compliant with the legislation. And if there isn't contracts in place, there's been customs and practices that, you know, are basically express terms and conditions. So ultimately, all employees have to engage in their contractual obligations to commit, you know, to the work function or their duties or their role. However, if people are refusing to engage, it's not good enough, you know, or it probably wouldn't be best placed for an employer to actually say, look, you know, we're moving ahead and we're doing it with or without you. It's better to engage with them, understand where their reservations are. What are their concerns? They could have, you know, care responsibilities, for example. They could have, and I mean that like outside the childcare, you know, arrangements that, you know, so many parents have to consider when they're returning to work. So you really do need to understand what their concerns are. Try and engage with them in a very, you know, understanding, empathetic way to, you know, listen to them. Actively listen to them, and to see, you know, okay, is there any sort of validity to the concerns that they've expressed? Because perhaps you haven't communicated, you know, effectively the measures that you've taken to maintain their health, safety and welfare. Or perhaps you didn't engage with them and say, look, we're having longer opening hours. Obviously, you know, you can veer into breaches of contract if you're talking about, well, my contract says I'm working from 9 to 5. So it's really about that positive engagement. Again, as I said earlier, to get their buy-in and feedback in relation to these measures. And remembering that these are potentially temporary measures to be put in place for changes to work practices. So it's really about getting agreement for the temporary implementation of certain work practices until, of course, we get further guidance, hopefully in the coming months, from the government and the Health and Safety Authority and the HSE in relation to the minimisation of risk of COVID-19, or, you know, they might make changes as well that we can't consider at this moment in time. So everything is about temporary measures being put in place. Again, that would be constantly reviewed, and you should have review periods in all your plans, in your communications plan, in your work practices plan, to ensure that you're adapting the needs to your business or your organization, and that you consistently are communicating and getting the feedback of employees. I think, and I will finish, I don't mean to go on for this answer, but I think that if an employee outright refused to come back and there wasn't any validity or legitimacy, like perhaps underlying health conditions wasn't a factor, it was simply a simple no, that then moves it into a possible disciplinary situation. Remembering that, like, just because we're in this pandemic, it doesn't negate your responsibilities as an employer to follow due process, natural justice. All of these items, are really important, because if it resulted in any form of termination, not that, a refusal to carry out a task would necessarily result in termination, but if it did, the WRC is going to open, there's going to be a floodgate of claims to the WRC, and they will be inundated. And ultimately, we have to consistently think of, what are the risks with me as an employer taking a certain action by unilaterally imposing things. So you need to just figure it out on a case-by-case basis, really.
Okay, that's great, Sarah. Thanks so much. Moving into the final stages of the presentation now, and one of the last things we'll look at is workforce planning. So in terms of looking at the workforce that you have now, and perhaps right sizing and thinking about right sizing for the future as we enter into the new normal. Sarah, if you could take us through just some thoughts around that, it would be a big
look, I think, before, workforce planning used to be an investment that a lot of organizations would say, look, we don't have either the financial means or the time to invest in workforce planning. But now more than ever, it is paramount that every organization is looking at workforce planning as a necessity, because there has been changes to every business. No one is without reproach, and ultimately you need to fit your organization into the future purpose of what that means for your business. So workforce planning is an essential activity. I would say that, in the main, workforce planning could be divided into, a reorganization and restructuring that looks at right sizing. What are the organizational skills and needs of the business? What do my current cohort of employees have in terms of experience and skills? And how does that match up to see, how do I, or what do I need to do to right size my organization? But there's a level of work involved in terms of reorg and restructure, and there's a lot of risks attached to it from an employment law perspective. Where we've seen, and we've had to sort of engage in a WRC or a labour court on behalf of employers, where they have sort of sidestepped, what would be required in that type of process. Because with any right sizing and sort of identifying your current needs and future proofing your organization, the fact is that, you need to ensure that there's proper selection procedures applied. You need to ensure that you've reviewed the financial aspects. What does it mean for the organization by having, 20 employees in the same role when our needs have diminished? How does that correlate from a financial perspective in building your business case for right sizing? It may not result in any sort of, type of dismissal or anything like that, because I would see redundancy almost as a separate process. But it certainly means that you need to do your due diligence when it comes to assessing the organizational needs and skills, and the future needs, or the anticipated future needs based on market demographics. The other area, obviously, in the sort of medium or even, I suppose, short-term plan at the moment, because we do have a number of employees that are currently laid off, are currently on short time and so forth. And you need to assess, okay, should you be approaching the sort of reorg restructure from a redundancy point of view? Now, when it comes to redundancy, the level of risk, honestly, is quite high when it comes to the redundancy process. Even more so when you're in a collective redundancy process, you need to ensure that you're looking at it from you know, a fair selection process, natural justice, but there's also legislatively compliant steps that must be taken in a collective redundancy process, such as notifying the minister, having the mandatory information and consultation period, and you know, establishing your business case and so forth. That, you know, if you don't follow those legislative requirements, ultimately it could mean that you're faced with unfair dismissals or something like that at the end of the process. You know, the other thing is that, like, you know, with any right sizing of your organization and assessing the needs, the current needs, medium and long term, what is anticipated from the market demographics, it could mean that you need to, you know, if you haven't done it already, reduce the workload or even increase workloads or implement pay cuts. And all of that has to be done in a process that is, you know, it involves engagement with employees. It involves, you know, not unilateral sort of decisions being imposed on people, but engagement at a level that you're trying to communicate the challenges faced by the business. You're then, you know, putting to the employees the proposals in relation to any pay cuts, reduction in workloads, or perhaps increase in workloads. And then you're looking for their agreement in relation to that. Now, refusals do arise in those situations, but you know, it's at that point that you then have to reassess if somebody is refusing and if the needs have been so changed that you may have to place an employee at risk of redundancy. But there are so many sort of legal requirements when it comes to, you know, the proper HR best practice and the actual procedures that have to be employed in any sort of right sizing, redundancy, alternative practices, that employers need to step carefully when it comes to that area, basically to manage the impact that could come from employees by, you know, imposing decisions on them. Other areas, obviously, for workforce planning would relate to the remote working. Now, I know I've already spoken to that under the work practices, but it is an area that potentially will continue, and it will continue for some time. But again, it all kind of fits back in, you know, from the commencement of workforce planning in future-proofing your organization, looking and assessing at the needs, and you know, getting engagement and feedback from your employees. I think the common thread through all of these slides is that engagement and communication is really paramount to implementing any of these objectives. But these objectives are necessary for future-proofing your organization.
Great, Sarah. Thanks. One question just before we move on. In terms of selecting the employees to bring back from temporary layoff, if there was any claim that somebody had been unfairly selected to come back and somebody else and so on, how do you ensure that that didn't happen for an employer?
Yeah, so look, a lot of organizations I think would be faced with this situation, so it's a good question. But when it comes to layoff or short time, the definitions of those two practices are enshrined in the Redundancy Payments Acts. So, you know, it's a given that you need to employ fair selection procedures, you know, not alone to choose people to go on layoff for short time, but also to bring them back to work. And in order to do that, it's really about assessing your needs. So it's having that workforce planning initiative to sort of right size your organization. Because, for example, if you're, let's say, have different departments in your organization, certain departments may not be working at full tilt because the need has been diminished. If you're in the hospitality industry, you know, certain areas of your hotel or restaurant may not be able to be open because you have aligned the health and safety protocols and you're compliant with those. So it's really about assessing the needs and then selecting. You would do that through, you know, a matrix type approach by looking at the required skills, experience, and so forth. And then, you know, engaging with employees. Say, for example, if you have two employees with the same skill set, the same level of experience, but there is perhaps only a need for one, basically trying to add additional layers to that, because you need, as I spoke to earlier, to have employees cross-trained, to ensure that you're managing absences if anyone does become ill with COVID-19 or for any other reason. So it's really having documented selection practices in place. I think a matrix is a good approach, and I think it will help identify specific skill sets and experience that will justify any decision you have to make in bringing one person back over another.
Great, thank you very much. We're going to move to the final section now, which is the unintended consequences of returning to work on the return to work journey. But before we do that, there's a question that's just come in terms of health and safety induction training, or the lead worker induction training. Tony, I'll just hand this over to you, and just be mindful that you're on mute. So when you're answering. So the question is there a statutory requirement for the employer lead to be certified re-induction training in the return to work? If so, how do you get certification?
Well, excuse me. The certification comes from the supplier. So there is no QQI or fee tag, as it used to be, for that. So you source the course from a reputable supplier. Adare Human Resources do all three. And when I say the three, you've got the lead worker, you've got the induction, but people also forget about the first aid responders. They also have to get a 1 hour upskilling, because things have changed drastically with COVID. So in short, my answer is you will get the certificate from the supplier that you're happy with.
Okay, that's great, Tony. Thank you very much. So just as our final slide today, it's all about the unintended consequences of the return to work journey. And as both Sarah and Tony referred to throughout the presentation, the return to work plan will drive all of the decisions that you make, but there are unintended consequences to each decision that you make. For example, if you have a continuing remote workforce or a continuing flexible workforce, for example, we've experienced with clients over, say, 5 days working over 7 that they might have, and those the consequence of doing that means you might have somebody who is going to work on a Sunday where they previously did not work on a Sunday, and that would attract a Sunday premium payment, and you would have to adjust their terms and conditions to account for that. So that's the kind of unintended consequences we're looking at. Another unintended consequence is an ongoing employee expectation around flexible work. So a lot of us have begun to focus on outcomes as opposed to working time, and giving our employees a lot more flexibility than they may previously have had. That generates an expectation, and that unintended consequence then means that you need to manage that expectation with your employees. Changed roles are another thing that is an unintended consequence of the circumstance that we find ourselves in. Many of your employees will have stepped up into new roles. Maybe that's a communications and marketing role that they wouldn't have had previously. Perhaps they are managing teams of people that they wouldn't have managed previously. And maybe they've thrived in that context. And that means now that as part of your workforce planning, you need to look at where they fit into your new organization. You wouldn't have expected to have to do that with that particular employee prior to your COVID-19 response or prior to your return to working plans, but it's something that is now an unintended consequence and needs to be built in to your overall journey back to work. There might be others that we haven't considered here, and they are knock-on consequences, and they do need to be looked at and considered in your return to work plan. I just see here there is another question that has come in. Ronan McCarthy has asked, is it statutory? I'm assuming, Ronan, that you're referring to the return to work training. So if that's the case, Tony, I think it is mandatory, but I'm not sure if it's statutory. You might respond to that.
It's not set out in legislation, but it's set out in the government protocol. And as I said at the start of my piece, the Minister of the day stated that it was mandatory for all employers. So you'd want to have a very, very good reason to be able to say, no, I'm not adhering to the custom and practice, because we've had 3 weeks of it, the mandatory element of it. So woe betide the person who deviates from it.
Yeah.
I might add to that as well. Like the Health and Safety Authority are obviously with their inspectors, sort of giving them powers in relation to attending premises to look at the compliance point. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Tony, but that they may be able to issue prohibitive notices and restrictive notices when it comes to, their compliance checks from their authority.
Very much so. The inspectors, as I said earlier, they have the role now to go out, whether it's a subject of a complaint, whether it's an ad hoc inspection, but they can come in and there's 3 notices, improvement, amongst others, and they can say, here's what you're going to do, and you have a month at the outset to put them in place.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tony and Sarah, for answering those questions. We're going to lose Tony now. He has another meeting to attend. So thank you very much, Tony, for joining us on the webinar this morning. I'm going to focus on a couple of final emails. Gary will respond to any details that you require in terms of the training that Tony referred to earlier, and that Adair can deliver that training. So Gary Monks, our business development person, will be in touch with you directly with regards to that training. In terms of key takeaways from today's webinar, I'll just run through them very quickly. So it's really important that you establish a return to work task force. And I use task force very loosely, but it's basically a team of people within your organization who will develop, consult on, and communicate your return to work changes or policies. As we've seen in the last couple of days, as a number of our retail outlets have returned to work, they all had a group of people who were focused only on the return to work post-COVID. So it's really important that you have that team of people who can consider all the different aspects of the returning to work that are important for your organization. As Sarah mentioned earlier, a return to work pulse survey is absolutely critical to understand what your employees and potentially your customers think about returning to the workplace and returning to your place of work, or if they're visiting and so on. So taking that survey is really important. Plan out your new norm, ways of working, including on how you'll run meetings, how you'll collaborate in team, and how communications in particular will be managed. What's important there is ensuring that all your employees and stakeholders feel included in the communications process, and that there's no drop off when you have a blended team of remote workers and on-site workers. It's essential that you provide COVID-19 induction and reboarding training for all staff. As Tony mentioned, we can support that if needed, but it is a mandatory requirement of the return to work protocol. Make sure that you have a pre-return to work form for employees to complete at least 3 days before their return to work. There are templates available on our website for those who might need those, and Gary again can provide a pre-return to work form template should you need it. Ensure you've planned how you will deal with a suspected case of COVID-19 and whether or not your first aid responder will be the person who will deal with that case in your workplace. I would ensure that you appoint a dedicated manager in charge of dealing with suspected cases of COVID-19 and that you have it built into your COVID-19 response plan. Update your business and safety plans, including the COVID-19 response plan, as I said, and your occupational health and safety risk assessments and the safety statement. Appoint and train at least one lead worker representative to make sure that all the COVID-19 safety measures are in place and being followed. And finally, communicate, communicate, communicate. That's what we've heard throughout this webinar, and it is the most important tenet of a successful return to work for any organisation. And with that, I'll finish up and maybe hand over to Linda for any questions that might have come through since we've been in discussion.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, you've obviously monitored some of the questions that came in there from Q&A. If anybody has any more questions, they're welcome to put them in now. But I think you guys have covered everything really succinctly, and thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. If anybody wants the details for the training or any of the details that the guy spoke about, please email me and I can put you in touch directly with Gary, and we can take care of that, no problem. But for now, I think that is it. I'll just give one last check. No, I think we've got everything covered, guys. Thank you so much.
Great.
No problem.
And Gerald, if you're there, maybe you just want to close off today.
Gerald's on mute, I think.
I think he's on mute, yeah. Well, look, I suppose just on behalf of Waterford Chamber, if I can thank Adair HRM for facilitating today. Really comprehensive overview there, and I suppose a lot of people still uncertain as to what's going on, but you know, you made it so much clearer for us. So thank you to all of you for taking the time to do that today. And of course, obviously, we'll keep in touch with you. And for anybody that that needs further information, please don't hesitate to get in touch directly with me, and I'll put you in touch with Gary. So thanks again, guys, and I hope you all stay safe.
Sorry, Linda. Sorry, that is one of the joys of a Zoom conference, because you can still receive calls. So unfortunately, on another call towards the end of that. So again, look, thanks for Linda for handling that for me. And guys, thank you very much for your participation in that. And as Linda said, if you have any questions or any additional information that you require, please give us a call. Thanks very much and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald.
Here.